Hello everybody, Vic here, and today I'm ranking the Evil Dead franchise, a franchise that began in the early 80s and has spawned 4 or 5 decades of mostly consistent, good sequels. You know, sometimes they take a break between films, a pretty long break, but they usually come back with a bang. I'm a huge fan of the Evil Dead franchise, have been since the very beginning. The very first film I saw in the franchise on TV was Army of Darkness. That's right, the television version of Army of Darkness. Didn't know that it was a sequel. I just saw Army of Darkness, and I was a standalone film. You know, grew up a little bit, went on the internet, found out there was 2 previous films, Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2. Those films never came on TV because there's so much damn blood and gore that you really can't edit that for a TV version. So had to rent Evil Dead 2 on video, on DVD. Finally saw him, became a big fan. Evil Dead 2013 saw on Blu-ray. And then both the last 2 Evil Dead films have seen in theaters. So listen, I've been a huge fan of the franchise from the very beginning, but I feel like it's time to do a proper ranking. In the comments, let me know what is your favorite Evil Dead film and your least favorite. And of course, if you like this video, hit the thumbs up, the like button, and subscribe if you have not. All right, so we have 6 films, gonna rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. But I do want to start off, say ahead of time that listen, all these films are pretty good. There's no stinker in this franchise. There's no Halloween Resurrection. There's no Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5. There's no big sort of missteps. There's no Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. That's right, New Beginning fans. I'm calling you out. I am not on the New Beginning as a new cult classic train. Everybody's pushing me on the internet. Friday the 13th, Facebooks, Reddit message boards, trying to hype up Friday the 13th Part 5. I'm not buying it. I'm calling that a misstep. Evil Dead doesn't have that, you know, it doesn't have a terrible entry. It's been very consistent, mostly because for the most part, Sam Raimi has always sort of been involved, whether it be the director of the first 3 or producer now. The original Evil Dead team does a good job of staying involved, I think helping with the quality control so we don't get a trash sequel. So I like all these films for the most part, but some I definitely like a lot more than others. So, all right, let's get to number 6 on the list. And this is going to be the newest Evil Dead film, Evil Dead Burns. Went to see this in theaters on opening weekend. You know, it was not a packed house. The film didn't do as well at the box office as they may have anticipated. Apparently made about half as much as Evil Dead Rises made, which we'll talk about a little bit about the future of the Evil Dead franchise and what that means and maybe what's going on. Why was the newest one not as successful at the box office as the last one? Like usually you'd see people like Evil Dead Rises, so you'd see a progression of maybe the hype gets better, things get bigger with each sequel, but that wasn't the case here. Luckily, all the films keep a relatively low budget, so even though Evil Dead Burns did not do great at the box office, the budget was so low that it still turned a profit. And the new one, Evil Dead Wrath, has already been filmed coming next year, so we're still good to go in a healthy place for the franchise. But let's talk about Evil Dead Burns. Okay. There's going to be spoilers here, so if you haven't seen the film, and many of you probably have not because it's obviously a brand new film, skip to number 5 on the list if you don't hear spoilers here, because I can't talk about this film without spoiling some things. Evil Dead Burns is solid. It is... How can I describe this? It's basically, it's not the least fun Evil Dead film, because that'll be 2013. But there's not much humor here, and the humor they do try doesn't really work. The movie is brutal, though. There's some brutal scenes, some scenes that kind of make you see certain scenes in horror films, you're like, ooh, Even if sometimes it's not the most gore, like a character will fall on a sharp object or something happens, just makes you kind of cringe. And I was all shaking in the theater being like, man, that is rough. So the brutality is definitely there. But the failure of the new one is basically, I would say, 2 things. The characters themselves, you know, they've been going with this idea recently of like a new character, a new set of characters who followed each film. There's no consistency of the characters from one movie to the next, which, you know, with a book of demons, you just need any random character to read from the book. You know, the Deadites get released, and you can kind of keep repeating that formula. So I understand that. You don't really need a consistent main character, even though the first 3 ones definitely had one big, larger-than-life looming main character hanging over the shadows of every film. You don't necessarily need that, but if you're going to give us a new main character and a new set of characters in each film, you gotta really make them good, solid, likable characters. Like if you're asking us to get on board with a new main character at the beginning of every single film, you gotta give us something to hold on to. And I would say the characters in Evil Dead Burns are the weakest characters we've seen in the franchise. They're mostly unlikable, and They use, I mean, newer horror films sometimes try to use like something traumatic from the character's background. They'll give us weird flashbacks or flashbacks of some kind of traumatic situation that means the character is like stressed out and going through tons of mental health issues on the side while they go through the actual issue of fighting the demons and all that stuff. But it's gotten kind of lazy. In this film, it feels kind of lazy. They're giving us a character who I guess we're supposed to sympathize with and be emotionally connected to because she's had a troubled past and has gone through some trauma. But it's kind of lazy, and we really don't connect with the main character. I think the way they want us to. And also the flashbacks they show us to get on board, showing us her past. They're kind of vague and undefined, and they take a while to put together like what's actually happening and did it actually happen. And so that, and then the side characters. I mean, there's an older woman character who. If there's comedy in the film, she brings the comedy. But even then, it doesn't, a lot of it doesn't work. So it's hard to describe. It's like there's some attempts at comedy, but Bruce Campbell came out recently and said the new films need more comedy and they need more like colorful and bright and stuff. And yeah, this film is like kind of grim and bleak, and it's a dark film with dark undertones, and it's just not a fun Evil Dead film. And like I said, there's a film higher on the list that's not necessarily a fun film either. It doesn't have to be fun. But if you're going to go like dark and grim and grimy and trauma and all this stuff, you're going to give us that kind of Evil Dead film, you got to give us better characters when we have her. There's just not likable characters here for the most part. And then, spoilers, I'm going to talk about the ending for a second. This movie just goes on way too long. There's this great natural endpoint for the film where, you know, our main character escapes from the house is burning down, all seems well, it's a perfect ending, but then the damn boyfriend character comes out of the fire, and this boyfriend character, he's there at the beginning, and then he disappears for the entire movie. And we're meant to believe, oh, this whole time, he was just, on his way to the house? Where the hell was he? As his entire family, his entire crew basically died and the house burned down. And when he comes back at the end, I've heard that it's like a mix of practical and CGI, but his character looks like freaking Hollow Man, like Kevin Bacon playing Hollow Man. Like, it looks like this freaking CGI weird thing that doesn't belong in the Evil Dead franchise. And the whole ending plays out like Terminator, like the Terminators after Sarah Connor. That's how it feels like at the end. So the movie goes about 15 minutes too long, and the ending is just a little bit too much. So the ending being too much and the characters being, kind of shakier, I would say, earns this to the bottom of the list, but it's still a solid Evil Dead film, and it's worth watching for sure. But it plays into kind of an idea here of like, we've seen the Deadites now, and we've seen the makeup, and if you're going to keep making these films, you got to almost come up with something new now, because at this point, it's like, we know about the book, we know about the Deadites. You can't just like keep upping up the brutality and the gore and think that's what the audience wants. The Evil Dead fans, it's not about the gore. It was never about that in the first few films. And it's not about brutality. This is not like the Terrifier franchise. So, but it seems like that's the direction they're going with this last one. We got to see what happens next year with Evil Dead Wrath. But they got to start opening things up and doing something different, get some new locations, do some different things. Instead, like the Deadite thing is getting a little bit played out now. And it wasn't before because we had so much time between sequels. You had Evil Dead in 2013, which obviously was, a long time, almost 20 years after Army of Darkness, and then obviously Evil Dead Rises was like 10 years later. So, but then seeing this new one just a couple years later, it doesn't feel fresh. It doesn't feel oomph. It feels kind of tired and played out. And so I'm hoping to see what they do with the next one. Apparently the next one's going to take place in the 70s, so that's something different. But it can't be the same old jazz with the Deadites and how they act and stuff. They got to find some new things here for the Evil Dead franchise to prosper going forward. I think also some space between films might be a good idea as well. This one's coming out, the new one's going to come out a year after this one, and this one already shows like a little bit of fatigue from the audience in terms of the box office. So we'll see what they do with it though. Okay, let's get to next on my list, and this is probably something that's going to give me some backlash, and I understand completely, but number 5 on my list is actually the original Evil Dead film with Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi, the one that started all, back in the early 80s, I want to say 1981. I rewatched the original Evil Dead and I like it, but the acting's pretty bad, and although the effects are good, I think that there's I think part 2 ends up being a better version of part 1, basically. So I'm getting everything I need from this setup in part 2, so it makes me less enticed with part 1, especially on rewatches. I almost just want to skip ahead to Evil Dead part 2. It's still solid for what it is. The makeup and the effects are still really good for the time period. But probably the more interesting thing about the original Evil Dead is more of the making of the movie, the behind the scenes. And I would recommend everybody to read Bruce Campbell's first book, If Chins Could Kill, because he gets in the background about how him and Sam Raimi and Rob Tapert, they were college kids, fresh out of college, no money, no idea what to do with their lives. They'd been making films throughout their childhood together, so they were like, hey, let's try to make a feature film. Went to a bunch of local businessmen, dentists, lawyers, trying to raise the money to put together a healthy budget to make a low budget film, and then off to the woods of Michigan to make the film. And this movie just has a great behind the scenes story of how it was made, how these kids kind of came together, childhood friends, to make this movie, and then against all odds, it became a huge hit. So I love that part of it. I love the whole making of it, and I love that it establishes the franchise. But I gotta be honest, on rewatches, I'm not in love with The Evil Dead, the first movie, and it is called The Evil Dead, I believe, actually, and not just Evil Dead. Well, I don't know. I gotta look back. Is it called Evil Dead or The Evil Dead? I don't know. But I'm just, Evil Dead is not as good to me as some of the other movies in the franchise, but it's the original, and I have a high respect for it. And I love, again, the story of how it was made. All right, let's get to number 4 on the list. And this is gonna be Evil Dead Rise. Now, saw this in theaters a couple years ago. It has probably of the last 3 full. Okay, I'll say in the entire Evil Dead franchise, this one has the best Deadite performance. Okay, the main girl who becomes the Deadite here, she is amazing. Her facial expressions, the investment she puts into the character, the movements. It's the best Deadite performance in the franchise for sure. In terms of everything else in the film, it's very interesting. It has an apartment setting, but I actually feel like they don't maximize the apartment setting as much as they could. It's mostly confined to the inner of their apartment building or their apartment room. But I would love to have really got into more of the apartment building, you know, having the Deadites chase them up and down the elevator to the different floors, terrorizing all the tenants in the building. It just feels like there's more room on the table, in my opinion, for using that apartment building setting. But for what we got, it's a good, strong story. It's getting more into a family being terrorized, which is different for the franchise. So I like Evil Dead Rise a lot. It's solid. And after seeing Evil Dead Burn, I do appreciate Evil Dead Rise more because I think Evil Dead Rise has better characters, and having one really fantastic central Deadite character who steals the show. I like that a lot. I want to go back to a second for Evil Dead Burn, though. The standout for the film for me is there's a father character who plays one of the main Deadites, and that dude is awesome. That dude has a great, freaky, terrorizing look and facial expressions, and somebody online mentioned maybe he should play Freddy Krueger, and honestly, he's probably a little bit older than I would like to play Freddy, but everything else feels like he could definitely pull off Freddy. But okay, let's get to number 3 on the list. Now, this is the Holy Grail top 3 for me, and number 3 is going to be Evil Dead from 2013. Evil Dead 2013 is the grimmest one, the darkest one, the one with the least amount of humor. But it really works there. I don't know. I think maybe because it was just coming off such a long layoff from Army of Darkness. We had been so hungry for anything Evil Dead-wise at this point in 2013. This came along, and of the supposed remakes, if we want to call it that, you know, the whole Platinum Dunes era that I pretty much hate because 70% of those remakes were absolute trash. There was some great ones. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the 2003 is fantastic. Friday 13, 2009 is pretty good. But Evil Dead 2013 is probably one of the best, if not the best, to come out the bunch. You have a great main character with Mia, who, honestly, they could have brought her back for Evil Dead Rise, and you could have kept following her story, kind of wasted potential there. You have her and a relationship with her brother. They have a good, strong foundation for the film. And it's the cabin setting, but it's like just really grim and nasty and gory. And some of the stuff that happens in that cabin is pretty crazy. I'm a huge fan of Evil Dead 2013. Holds up big time on rewatches. And I think that... So one thing I want to get into now is basically, we'll talk about this for a second. There's 2 sort of Evil Dead fans in the franchise, I feel like. There's Evil Dead fans that I think came on board around the time of 2013, and they really kind of grew up with, and their experience with Evil Dead, for them, their Evil Dead is Evil Dead 2013, Evil Dead Rise, not Evil Dead Burn. And those fans of the franchise, I think, they lean towards more being fans of the more serious Evil Dead tone. So you have that audience, but then you also have some of us who grew up with the earlier films, Army of Darkness, Evil Dead 2, the original Evil Dead. Obviously, Bruce Campbell just hangs over the franchise as such an amazing, iconic character as Ash. And then, of course, the Ash vs. Evil Dead TV show. So we have those fans that I think want more humor out of Evil Dead and see Evil Dead as more almost like horror comedy than straight horror. So you have those, that kind of divide amongst the fans. And of serious Evil Dead films, I think Evil Dead 2013 is probably going to be as good as you can do it. And I think what stands out is that it's such a departure, such an opposite tone from the first three films, that it really stands out in a positive way. But when you keep beating that drum and try to one-up that and do more grimy, more gory, more darker, less humor, I think you lose something with every entry. They kind of move in that direction. And I'm with Bruce Campbell. I'm for bringing back the comedy, to be honest. We've had three fairly serious films. I just want to see them go in the opposite direction, but I don't think it's going to happen because Evil Dead Wrath was already filmed, and I don't think Evil Dead Wrath is, any kind of horror comedy. I'm guessing it's going to be straight horror, but I'm more in the camp, as you'll see from my top two on the list, I'm more in the camp of, Evil Dead to me is supposed to be tongue-in-cheek, scary if you can have some scares, but I look at them more as horror comedies, but that's because of my upbringing, the time I grew up. I grew up in more of the comedic ones. I understand completely if you're a newer fan and, your first exposure is Evil Dead 2013, like, oh, serious-ass horror film with Deadites, and now you've gotten two since then, and you're like, man, this is what the Evil Dead franchise means to me. I get that completely. I just fall in the other camp of preferring the humor. And that brings me to my number 2 on the list, and that's going to be Evil Dead 2. One of my great memories as a kid, I was in high school, but I went to the video store and I rented Evil Dead 2, Dawn of the Dead, Return of the Living Dead, and Night of the Living Dead. And it was the first time I was going to see 3 of those 4 movies, and I watched them all that weekend. It's my greatest video renting experience of all time because they're all classic films, but Evil Dead 2, the mix of comedy and horror is so perfect. And the character Ash, who... the physical comedy is so fantastic. You would think almost that Jim Carrey had studied Bruce Campbell in terms of the physical comedy, that thing's going on here, because some of the stuff Jim Carrey does later in the 90s looks a lot like Ash here in Evil Dead 2, but it's just fantastic. So many good, fun things when Bruce Campbell, takes out the hand with his chainsaw, and then the hand has a mind of its own, the blood coming from the walls, the talking deer on the wall. There's so many fun moments in Evil Dead 2. I love the effects. I love the tone. Watching it on Blu-ray or 4K is a treat that I treat myself to probably once a year. It's just fantastic. I mean, I love Evil Dead 2. What can be said about it? And again, to me, it improved so much on the original Evil Dead that it makes the first Evil Dead less valuable to me. Like, if we didn't have Evil Dead 2, I would value the original Evil Dead more, it'd be higher on the list. But I feel like between the two films, I don't know if you need both films. I feel like you need Evil Dead. Evil Dead 2 is a better version, giving more of what I want, enhancing the effects. It feels like the movie they probably originally wanted to make, but didn't have the budget to make that with the first one. So I think it's just a superior film than the original Evil Dead, and just holds up very well. So Evil Dead 2 is number 2 on the list. But number 1 on the list, and I think this is probably controversial, because I think with most Evil Dead fans, Army of Darkness is kind of like, it's really loved, but there is some that just kind of push back on the idea of like, hey, this is not even a damn horror film. Like, it is an outlier in the franchise. Like with Army of Darkness, this is, damn it, an action-adventure film. Like, the horror elements are turned very down. There's 1 or 2 parts in the film where they sort of seem to aim for horror a little bit, but for the most part, we just got Bruce Campbell looking like a badass, giving great one-liners, screwing up the entire film, putting everybody around him in a precarious situation with the Deadites, bringing the Deadites back to life. I love the entire end sequence, the Deadite army versus everybody at the castle. And man, it's just, there's a rewatchability to Army of Darkness that reminds me of Tremors. Tremors and Army of Darkness are these fun early 90s films that you can rewatch, that you can just love, have fun with. And man, I'm just a huge fan of Army of Darkness. It's probably in my top 25 favorite films of all time. I've seen Army of Darkness 5,000 times. There's a version of it that I can't find, though, because the first version I saw of it was on TV, and that TV version had some added scenes, and they were not in the final cut. The TV one I saw was like 90 minutes, 95 minutes. I know there's like a director's cut on DVD and Blu-ray, but I don't think that's the same as the TV version. I've never been able to find the TV version. Maybe to look on eBay, see if they have it there. But yeah, Army of Darkness is great. So anyways, again, it's a consistent franchise. Like I said, it's a very interesting franchise because you have that divide of, the serious films and the comedic films, and you have different groups of fans within that kind of competing with each other, their opinions in terms of what's the better direction to go in. I personally would love them to bring back some comedy, but it's never going to be the same because the thing is, the comedy was coming from Bruce Campbell mostly. Yes, the Deadites were pretty tongue in cheek, but Bruce Campbell is somebody who can be a badass, can be comedic, and you really can't. It's gonna be hard to replicate that. Like, I don't know, but note on everything. I've only seen the first season of Ash vs. Evil Dead. I gotta sit down and watch that damn show because there were so many good things. I know it's 3 seasons, so I have to definitely sit down and watch that in its entirety. But that's the only reason I didn't rank that in the list because I've only seen the first season. But in the comments, let me know if anybody's seen the full Ash vs. Evil Dead show. Is it worth watching the entire 3 seasons? Is it great? Whatnot? And then just tell me in the comments again, what is your favorite Evil Dead film? And then what direction do you think the franchise should go in? Do you think it should be more comedic? Would you like it to see it to return to the slapstick style of Army of Darkness? Or do you like the more straight horror direction of 2013, of the new one? Do you like do they need to do something different? In my opinion, they need to change up the formula because the same old tired reading from the book, the Deadites come back. It's all starting to get a little bit formulaic to me. And I don't think this is a franchise that should just rest on its laurels. They should, not, I don't mean add to the lore, but introduce some new things or just continue to do new settings. I don't know, but the franchise needs something unique going forward because I think there's going to be some fatigue with how they've been doing things. So anyways, that is my ranking of the Evil Dead franchise. Until next time, you guys take care.